The 80s wasn't a decade, it was a vibe, man. It was a feeling. It was an emotion. I remember being, 9 years old in the 80s, waking up and could not wait to get out into the real world. Could not wait to get out into to Saturday morning cartoons, or to bike riding around the neighborhood with my friends, or to whatever imaginative thing I was thinking about doing. And you just think about the 80s and you think about how it was so much more than just a decade, because it wasn't just a decade. It was a way of life. It was basically imagination. Everything was creative. When you look at the music scene, when you look at the art scene, from Jean-Michel Basquiat to, my favorite, Phil Collins, Studio, right? When you listen to the music of the 80s, when you listen to Phil Collins, In the Air Tonight, when you listen to, and it doesn't matter if you're listening to pop music, or if you're listening to rock and roll music, or if you're listening to hip hop music, or R&B, or Whitney Houston, it all feels so 80s. The 80s is a verb, man. When you say that's 80s, it all pops in your head. Big hair, big values, big, you know what I mean? And that's what I love about the 80s. How wild, free, and completely outlandish it was. Nobody cared, man. You wanted the big car, you wanted to have the big car, you wanted to have the big hair, you wanted to have the big shoulder pads, you wanted the big house, whatever, big pool, everything big. Didn't matter if it ran efficiently, that wasn't the point. It was all about big music, big concerts. Remember the US Fest? And I remember going into the 90s, and as I was becoming a teenager in the 90s, and then grunge killed, they so-called grunge killed 80s hair music. The reality is that's not true. The reality is, for me anyways, all of us grunge kids, well, me in particular, my crew, we still listen to 80s music. We still listen to all that stuff. We still listen to Whitesnake. We still listen to Motley Crue. We still listen to Bon Jovi. Bon Jovi Crossroads is a great album. I don't care what anybody says. So yeah, did it make it less cool for a while? It did. I gotta get out of this water. Hopefully this water doesn't damage my thing. And you find yourself in a magical world. The 80s was like a magical place where the music was magic, where the movies are magic. When you think about some of the greatest movies that were ever created, they came out of the 1980s, whether it be Return of the Jedi or The Empire Strikes Back, right? You think about Indiana Jones, and these are classics, absolute classics, that it didn't matter how old you were, if you were a parent or if you were a teenager or if you were a kid, everybody loved these movies. Everybody remembers, no, I am your father, right? You know what I mean? Even though I never watched those movies till probably in the later 80s, like Empire Strikes Back and stuff. I didn't watch that till a little bit later. But you just look at just the creativity, and you look at the people that came out of that decade, and it was just incredible. It was one of the most incredible decades ever. And then you juxtapose that with, say, like what's happening in 2020, where we're as technically advanced as we've ever been in all of known civilization. And here we are with all this technology and all of these skills to be able to make whatever we want, to be creative and do whatever we want. And what happens? We are literally, let's get under here. We are literally the least creative group we've ever been. Let me just dry this off. We're the least creative civilization decade. We're in the least creative. Because back in the days, you actually had to be able to, you couldn't just go on to the internet and type something in and search for information. You couldn't just go on to AI and create whatever you needed to create images that you required, you know what I mean? You couldn't do that. So when you start thinking about just the creativity and just how original and authentic and unique the 80s was. I know a lot of people said, there was a lot of fakeness in the 80s. And I'm sure there was. There always is going to be a little bit of that, no matter what decade you're in. But even with that, you still had the original, hairstyles, you had the original everything. Buddy, when you think back on it, when you look back on your 80s self, the hair and the flock of seagulls haircut, or the spiky, because you had punk rock in the 80s, you had new wave in the 80s, right? You had wild and crazy country music in the 80s. You had No Show Jones in the 80s, right? You had so many things happening in the 80s. And it was just so diverse, unique, and it was just, everything was its own thing. And in the 80s, people did not like to conform. People weren't like, oh, let's just try to be like everybody else in the 80s. It was always about, what can I do? How can I make my jean jacket the most original jean jacket possible? What bands can I put on it? What kind of buttons can I get, right? What kind of buttons can I collect? What can I get for glasses? What can I get to, where can I get the coolest boots from? Where can I get some nice, can I look through my dad's closet and see if I can kind of mix in some of his 70s clothes with my 80s clothes, And it was really about the originality, and it was about original spirit, and about being authentically you know what I mean? Don't get me wrong, you're influenced by media, and those influences are still there, and you're still gonna have people dressing punk rock because they saw it on TV. For the most part, you saw, though, a lot of people, doing their own thing, and you saw things stick for a lot longer, which I really loved. It's really snowing out here, so I gotta try to stay covered anywhere I'm at. But you just think about just that unique identity of the 80s. And I remember when my friends and when I'd wake up in the morning, say it was a weekend, I was so excited to wake up because I knew I was gonna get my Saturday morning cartoons. So I'd be watching these, Smurfs, and I'd be watching He-Man, and I'd be watching whatever else was on. What else would I really like? I liked Hercules, and you name it, man. I loved it all. Thundercats, G.I. Joe, right? I was younger in the 80s, you gotta understand. But I just felt like there was just, anything was possible in the 80s. Imagination still lived in the 80s, right? Kids still had imagination, because now in the 2020s, kids don't really have imagination because they have the internet, and all they have to do is Google search to see anything that they want. But when we were kids, we didn't have that. All we had was our imagination. So imagination, creativity was rampant in the 80s, which was incredible. And that's what made it so amazing. That's why you had great movies like Gremlins with Gizmo, right? And you had such great movies like Karate Kid. Just because it was, it was a certain vibe. It was a certain time. When you watched the movies, the music matched the movies. You know what I mean? It wasn't just like, it was like, even a lot of the times with the music or the movies in the 80s, the music soundtracks, like, they were written by like one person. So if you think about like Batman, the original Batman in the 80s in 1989, Prince did the whole soundtrack. That was an 80s thing. If you look at, and I just remember that, my favorite song off that soundtrack was when the Joker is dancing around the room, and he's sitting there singing black and white, red and green. And you got the Joker dancing, and he's like getting rid of all the paintings he doesn't like. Incredible. And just like how Prince did that whole album. And then you think about like even Flashdance, or you think about, what was it? Footloose. That's Kenny Loggins. Like, how many albums did Kenny Loggins do, right? And just the originality. You think about Rocky, and you think about, There's No Easy Way Out. My brother told me a story before that the song Eye of the Tiger was actually supposed to be used in Karate Kid, if you can believe that. And We Are the Best, I think it was called, in Karate Kid, was supposed to be used in Rocky IV, But thank goodness that changed, and we got Eye of the Tiger and Rocky IV. But you just, any song you listen, there's certain songs you listen to, you're like, it reminds you of the movie. That's what was brilliant about the 80s. When you think about The Breakfast Club, what are you thinking of? What song do you think about? Don't you forget about me, right? There's just think about, pick any movie in the 80s, and you're gonna be able to basically see it. Yeah, I love that song from that movie. And that's how it always was. And that's what made the 80s so incredible, was the attention to detail, right? It wasn't just, and you weren't just necessarily looking online. You couldn't just look online for like, okay, I want this style. I want to go onto eBay and find this shirt, or I want to go and find these, ankle warmers, or I want to find this. You actually had to go out and find things. The 80s, man, going to the mall in the 80s, going to the arcade in the 80s was like a magical place, man. And I think people, and that magic, because the imagination was still there, because we had the balance between the electronic world, the video game world, the television world still, and the outside world. We were a mix of inside and outside, and that was the beauty of it, was we weren't just one way. We weren't 80% online and 20% outside, right? We were literally like, I would say probably 70, 80% outside, 20% inside. Like we'd be inside to sleep, hang out with friends. But like that was it. And that was the beauty, the balance that was there in the 80s. There was, believe it or not, there was a lot of balance when it comes to just the life and nature, right? Which I really appreciated. So, and then you think about not only just that, but you think about the big characters of the 80s, right? You think about the Pee Wee Hermans. You think about just the originality of like Pee Wee Herman. Like who would have thought that he would be so wild and insane, right? That was crazy, man. That was the 80s, man. Characters like that got off the ground. You look at, like, name it, man. You name it. Everybody was so zany, right?
Why are they like?
Rock stars were still rock stars. Billy Idol was Billy Idol, man. He was a rock star. And it was fun. The 80s that was another thing. The 80s was so fun. It was, like you couldn't, if you got transported back into the 80s right now, and you were put into a mall, the music was awesome, the restaurants were awesome, the people were awesome, the hair was awesome, the clothes was awesome. And it had a certain feel, a certain vibe. And it had its own thing. It had a feel, right? When you went to your friend's place and you watched a movie, even though you had it on a smaller TV and it was through VHS for the most part, it was still so incredible. It was one of the most incredible things that watching a movie as a kid in the 80s with your friends for a sleepover, if you go over to your buddy's place and you're having a sleepover, was the funnest thing in the world, right? You would get all your snacks, usually Jolt Cola, chips, chocolate bars. And because you want the Jolt Cola so you could stay up late. And you would literally watch 3-4 movies in a row, usually scary movie, funny movie. Usually scary, funny. Maybe you'd have like Die Hard in there, right? And it was just like, and you just had so many great options because the horror movies were still campy, right? You could still really enjoy, but they also, it wasn't like completely destroyed with these special effects. Like CGI, in my opinion, has completely destroyed the creativity in movies, and it makes movies look terrible and they don't stand the test of time. Go back and watch The Labyrinth with David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly, and the puppeteers and Jim Henson. That movie is timeless. Why? Because I used the puppets, because it just feels so much more real and so much more authentic, and it can't change with time. It's hard to mimic that puppetry. When you look at some of these, how these movies are made, when you look at Willow, when you look at some of these great movies in the 80s with especially the puppetry and the horror movies, you look at what they did, It was magic, man. It was magic. It was real magic. Like they call them gimmicks. The gimmicks they used or the gags that they did were real. Like they actually had to come up with, here's how a bloody zombie looks, not just get some computer guy to do it. Here's what blood looks like, right? Here's what a severed head looks like, you know? So, and that just forces a level of creativity because you had to have ingenuity in the 80s, because you didn't have all of this electronic stuff, because you couldn't just get on a computer and then type in a couple commands, and now it's going to be AI. AI, you just start typing in commands, and you're going to start seeing a whole different kind of dynamic, because it just, as you can see, they call it AI slop for a reason, and I say it's the same thing with CGI. It's CGI slop. And having the real authentic like gags or people doing the actual makeup, people doing the actual scenes, people setting up the scenes, like the car scenes, the car chases, all that stuff was done real. Like the stunts were real. These are real times, right? You watch these movies and the stunts are real, right? You watch Top Gun, that stuff's not CGI. You know what I mean? You actually had to have people flying freaking planes and jets, or they had to make it look a certain way, right? Maverick. I mean, it was something else. And it made you believe that anything was possible. In the 80s, anything felt possible. Like I always felt in the 80s, I had such a big imagination. I never ever woke up and thought, no, I can't do that. I always thought it was possible, but I also believed in magical lands. I believed in, like the wild and wonderful world of the lands of Dungeons and Dragons and Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms. And I loved the world of Indiana Jones and Lost Crusade. Like those worlds seemed so imaginative and real to me. I felt like I could climb into them. When I was watching the movie, I felt like I was there and I felt like they existed. I don't know why. I just felt like I could go there and be there, That was what the 80s was like. It was a feeling, it was a vibe, it was an emotion. Because the 80s was unique and people still absolutely loved and embraced their individuality and embraced their uniqueness and actually tried to create something original. Which I absolutely love about the 80s was people were attempting to continue to create original material. It wasn't just about copying and copying and copying and copying and copying. You had anything from the Ramones to television, right? To Talking Heads, to Crowded Room. And you just listen to the classic music, to Heart. I remember how much I loved Heart from the 80s. And you look at everything and it's incredible. The absolutely originality that came out of that and how people truly stepped into themselves. It's a special place, and I think it holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts for a lot of reasons, because I think the journey was still there. When you watch The Goonies, your life was still a journey in the 80s, right? You still believed in the quest of life. Life wasn't just punch in, punch out. Life was so much more, right? The toys are cool, the toys were bigger, the toys were more interesting. It wasn't everything just on your handheld. Like you actually had physical toys. You would build things, you'd get Legos, you would build huge kingdoms, you know what I mean? It was a vibe. It was just something about it. There was something more physical about the 80s. You couldn't just hide away on the computer, hide away on the internet. You actually had to participate in life still. And you could go out there and the physicality of it all I love. You had to physically go out and buy albums, buy records, buy tapes, buy CDs, right? You had to physically go out to see bands play, right? Like you have to physically, in the 80s, the live music scene, I wasn't a teenager or an adult, but from talking to people in New York and in Toronto and Chicago and these places, they tell me that the music scene in every big city was absolutely massive because people still went out to see live music, because you couldn't just go out and And you can just go on the YouTube and watch any band. You could see clips of stuff on MTV, but actually going to a concert was a big deal. It was like the most important thing ever. And I don't think people understand how important it is because you really didn't have the chance to experience it unless you were there, right? It was a special thing. The 80s is a special time. So you tell me, did the 80s seem magical to you? Was the 80s a magical place that you loved to go visit in your dreams? And how do we bring a little bit of that 80s magic, that 80s originality back into the 2020s? How do we bring some of that 80s feel, some of that 80s creativity, some of that 80s uniqueness, some of that 80s individuality? Get away from the CGI, get away from the computers. How do we start making movies without computers again? Well, maybe not without computers, but let's try to limit the use of, you can use your digital camera or whatever to create the movie, but let's get away from computers. Let's get back to the physical. Let's get back to creating an actual movie with actual gags, with actual makeup, with actual, contraptions that worked, right? Not just CGI blood, CGI this, CGI that. Like, let's create again. Like, remember was it Night of the Living Dead 2, I think it was, when they're in the mall? But it's just, you look at Evil Dead 2, these are all movies that were made with no CGI, right? The Gate. And CGI, I think CGI, in my opinion, has ruined movies. I'd much rather watch these old action movies with no CGI, the old Schwarzenegger movies, the old Stallone movies, the old, like watch Predator. Predator might have had a little CGI, but not much, right? Watch Top Gun. Incredible, these movies. And no CGI, or very little CGI. All done through ingenuity and people just knowing what they're doing and developing a skill over years. Tell me what your thoughts are. What did you think about the 80s? If you were in the 80s, either as a kid or an adult, or if you were a teenager, let me know. Was the 80s magical? And why was it magical? Did the 80s have a feeling? Was it a vibe? Or was it just a simple decade? You let me know. I'm Matt Ross. I'm the Known Wolf.